We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
I mean, I think the weirdest thing about being in punk rock in 2025 is that when you tell or reflect on stories from 83 or 81, 82, 83, 83 is the year I started going to shows, is the notion that they're not exaggerations. Like, I'm shocked at the things we lived through. First hardcore show I ever went to was a Social Distortion show in 1983, which wouldn't even be called a hardcore show now, but it was in an abandoned classroom on a local college campus. And halfway through the show, people were running outside. Mike Ness is up there, doing his best golden era Mike Ness. And people are running outside to watch two girls bang each other's faces against a telephone pole. That and all the pictures you see of cops breaking up shows in the Palladium and things like that, and all these different these great gritty, bloody black and white photos. That really was early 80s California.
Yeah. And that's what hooked you. You're like, hey, I need to be around chaos and just.
Well, how are you going to do that, or at least be exposed to that? Not do that, but how are you going to be exposed to that in suburban Orange County and not feel more alive than you did the day before?
Yeah. It was, for me, I don't know if you've ever heard of this band, but my first show, I was probably about 12. Mm-hmm. And obviously with the Southern accent, I was growing up in the South, but it was a band called Anti-Scene.
I've heard, I'm familiar.
Yeah. So, all I remember is this place just going crazy. There's a pit, there's people stage diving. My older brother and his buddy, which when I say older, they were only about 14 or 15, are getting in the pit, all this stuff. And I'm just taking it all in. And the lead singer starts taking the microphone and headbutting it. And and back then, in the South, it was all like professional wrestlers, Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, and these guys that bleed, they cut their forehead and they just start bleeding and they wrestle like that. I think this band, if I remember right, was into like that.
So the guy was blading?
Yeah, he starts like headbutting the microphone while he's singing. He's a big burly dude, long hair and a beard, and blood just starts pouring down his face. And I'm thinking, yeah, I could see like Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes doing this. And it was chaos. But like you said, the next day or even later that day, we were just so hyped. And I don't know, man, it hooked me in. And from then on, as many shows as we could go to, we would go to. And we would have to drive a lot of times to college towns and stuff that were away from where we were. We were in a big city, but the scene was often college related. It was like if you had a local college, usually there was like some bar. And how it was like back then when you mentioned Social Distortion, like not being a whatever hardcore show, is just it's like a band playing. But
at the time the distinction wasn't as clear, and I frankly think it's attributed to Roger Murray, I think, but never trust a hardcore kid that didn't listen to punk rock, because to me it's their left leg, right leg on my counterculture skeleton. They're not one. One doesn't really exist independently of the other.
Yeah. Now, how did you know there was that show there? How did you even know about it?
Well, so literally in the late 70s. I was born in 1967, so you figure in 79, which is really when the Sex Pistols they're done. Winterland's happened. Their tour in the States has happened, but it's finally starting to hit 7th graders and 8th graders in the way that they dress in Huntington Beach, California. And I looked up to those guys. The guys in my elementary school and that were moving on to junior college or going down to Edison College and slowly morphing into punkers. They were exciting. Well, by 81 or so, it was my musical diet and it was my dress. By 83, I finally got up the stones to go to a show,
Yeah.
It was a matter of, I went to a Catholic high school, very, very straight-laced Catholic high school, but that had a really fervent strain of punk rock running through it. And I would see these guys from the year ahead of me, guys, Pat Dubar, Pat Longree. They would both end up in a band called Uniform Choice, but also their friends, Jay Wilkerson, Pete Ross, all of these big, scary young men were going to do something. And I was like, that's the kind of big, scary young man I want to be. So I just followed suit. And one night, I think it was Longree had mentioned that they were all going to Social Distortion that night. And I talked to my friend Paul Feit, I think it was, who went to that with me, and there we were, and I never looked back.
Dude, they're still, I think, touring. Like, I mean, Social Distortion, that is like, who would have thought that was still going on, when we were younger?
Well, I think Ness is kind of a freak level talent. I mean, there's so much ability oozing out of that guy. If he quit, I think the organism would explode. I kind of think until he can't physically do it, we're always going to see that guy.
Yeah, I've probably, I don't know. I'd probably say there's a handful of bands right now that I look at, still love their music, but it's like I'm looking at the guys playing the music, and they're in their late 50s, early 60s, but they still seem to be enjoying life. And a lot of them, it was like the bands broke up, everybody kind of like quote unquote grew up, and then all of a sudden they reunite or they get back together and start touring and realize a lot of people still want to go to shows. And there's a generation now that has kids. They want to take their kids to the shows. And it's like, it's crazy. You see like these two spectrums in age, but all the same energy, which I don't know.
It's funny. Well, it is funny. And it's also complicated because there are spaces in which the two mesh and in which they share common grounds generationally. And then there is a certain amount of land where never the two tween shall meet. When I was in Shiner's Club, we played a few shows with a band called Ursula and did all right. But we went to one particular venue in Los Angeles that was a youth collective and run by a very specific group of people and everything else, and saw absolutely no traction. And, members of the band were frustrated and everything else because that band was used to causing a little bit of like kind of a holy fuck response. And we got more of a go away response that night, and well, I mean, people weren't rude, but I had to kind of sit back and say, I don't just look like dad to these kids. I think I probably look a little bit older than dad, like I'd probably be interested in mom, It was just like, it was like, this is the part where a decade or two makes a difference, because at the end of the day, if you're a rebellious, energized, creative young person, you probably want at least a little bit of space that's just yours and not your forefathers. I don't need Johnny Rotten going to my shows.
Yeah. I think about it like the way, sort of, I always loved the music that my mom and my dad raised me on. Like they split up when I was, I don't know, 6 years old or whatever. So weekends at my dad's house for a year or two, it was always like the bachelor life where he's throwing these parties, but we're always listening to records. And I mean, he had old 45s with like, the Righteous Brothers and Benny King and Sam Cooke and like all this soul. My mom the same way. And so I always loved that sound. And even when I got a little bit older, around 10, and got into like, punk and hardcore, I'd still want to listen to Sam Cooke. Like it was not a whatever exclusionary. It I don't know, just kind of opened it up more. It's almost like reading a book. You don't read the same type of books, you read different ones.
Right.
So now,
I was just going to back up what you were saying about your parents' music. I mean, my dad was like kind of he was a recovering addict and had a bit of an outlaw vibe when I was growing up. But man, when we're riding around in his El Camino, it's all War and Sly and the Family Stone. And that's still some of my favorite shit. I feel like while I'm listening to his music, I start sprouting a Fu Manchu mustache. The aviator shades grow out of my face,
Look, dude, this less than probably 2 hours ago, I was messaging this guy, John. He was a former guest, but great guy. He used to guard President Obama when he was in the Secret Service. Now he's actually the security director for Shinedown and Motley Crue. Great guy to great conversations. And I sent him a list that I had created on Spotify of music, and it's called like Cobra Mustang music. And when I was a kid, my dad had a Shelby Cobra Mustang convertible.
Right.
He'd drop the top. My brother and I would get in there like little. I'm like 5 or 6 years old, and it had a roll bar on it, and we would hang from the roll bar while he's doing like Mach 3 and blast and whatever. Doobie Brothers, Allman Brothers, like
that music just sounds like Racing Stripes to you now.
Yeah, sure. It did, dude. It was like there's like very specific songs that would come on the radio, and for whatever reason my brain would lock it in. And my brother to this day, we still joke about like that era of music and going, man, like I kind of just wish I could smell that gas burning sitting in that Shelby. And him just freaking cruising
Mhm.
You know, I don't know. It's interesting how music does that. But now for you, you said, you know, you mentioned Shiners Club,
Mhm.
but going back to before that, you know,
Mhm.
you're in your youth, you had a few different bands, right?
Well, so I've done bands people have never heard of. I was in a band we referred to as the Bar Chords. You know, I was in trying to think what there was a band I did briefly even before that in '83, just for like half a minute
Uh-huh.
with people from the Orange County hardcore scene. But the first organized band I was in that eventually did records, but it wasn't the first band I did records in, was a band called Carrie Nation.
Mm-hmm.
And its first iteration took place in 1985 with my friends Gavin Oglesby, John Bruce, and a couple other guys. Literally a garage band that played on like $100 equipment and that caught fire during practices. And I used to scream so loud we didn't notice the PA had gone out because we could still hear the vocals. You know,
Oh, nice.
um,
Yeah.
and and that was kind of a weird band. The two of us from that band went on to form No for an Answer in 1987, and that was the first band I ever did a record with.
Yeah. Damn.
Yeah.
Yeah. My brother still has, I've got a picture somewhere.
Mhm.
He still has the actual notebook. And when he was
Mhm.
when he was in high school, he was in the art, right? So he saved a lot of flyers. I saved a
Mhm.
lot of flyers. And I tried my best as a kid to keep everything, every little artifact from a show, handwritten letters, you know, like corresponding with bands. But he still has a flyer in the sleeve, clear sleeve of his notebook from school,
Mhm.
and it's no for an answer. And now I can't remember. Oh, it's like 3 or 4 bands, but
Right.
it's a show out in California.
Mhm.
I'll have to find it. And
Mhm.
when he and I were going through records and stuff, and
Mhm.
now like 10 or 15 years ago, we got into a long conversation about all the like California hardcore bands.
Mhm.
And it was funny because when we were in the South, everything that we first kind of got introduced to
Mhm.
was the whole New York hardcore scene, you know,
Mhm.
Revelation Records and stuff like that. And then we kind of went kind of backwards and tried to find more bands out there.
Mhm.
And you know how it is for people listening that didn't grow up reading fanzines.
Mhm.
You look in a zine and you see an ad for like a record, you know, and then
Mhm.
you write that record label with, I don't know, $2 or $3, $4, and you get this record in the mail from a band putting everything out pretty much on their own,
Mhm.
you know, an entire country away. It
Right.
just, I don't know, that to me, it always blew me away that I say kids, but
Mhm.
even, you know, young adults, but like we're putting out music like that in a scene that was positive.
Mhm.
Like I grew up surrounded by a lot of alcohol and unfortunately some other people into like, you know, drugs and getting addicted. And then as an adult, I saw a lot of negativity out of that. But man, even at a young age, like I just didn't get into a lot of that. I always loved and was drawn to the positive aspects of it,
Right.
you know?
Well, my father and my sister, they both passed away now, but they were both addicts. So, you know, I was into punk rock first via like little British punk rock, leather jacket punk rock. I had, you know, stringy black hair, the whole 9 yards. But the second somebody exposed me to Minor Threat and to the Flex Your Head comp, and it was Pat Longry from Uniform Choice that did that. There was suddenly, besides music that represented my anger or that reflected sort of my internal energies, there was music that was attacking something that I saw destroying my family. So that's how straight edge and I, you know, that's where that symbiosis comes from. Is like, oh, hey, yeah, that's right over there, you know, at the other end of the 405 freeway. When I spend weekends with my dad, I can see that.
Yeah.
I can see the damage from these behaviors. You know.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the term straight edge, is funny. As a kid, like that was how I identified for a little while,
Mm-hmm.
and only just through the music. So
Oh,
the only way,
I did my 9 years marching with the Edge. I know, I know how it is. Yeah,
yeah. But it was interesting because people would see me wearing a T-shirt in the city I lived in, and they had no clue. They didn't understand it. So then I would have to explain it, especially if they just started talking junk about the band, or like I had one guy, you know, basically telling me that the music I listened to was crap, you know, and he's just like, oh, a bunch of fucking druggies and all. So I'm like, you're actually wrong. It's the opposite, you know.
right.
But that was so early on. I mean, that was, late 80s, mid to late 80s. But damn, I remember in the 90s, I was in the Army by then and still going to shows and, still buying records and writing bands. And there seemed to be such a shift that, I mean, my whole life, I didn't get into alcohol or drugs or any of that, but I didn't care if other people did. That was my thing too. It was like, I just want to do my thing. And obviously, as I got a little bit older, I didn't want to be just those parameters. Or in the 90s, when everything started to seem to get so militant, it was an eye opener for me. Like there's certain bands that kind of resonate with everybody, and it didn't resonate with me.
There were too many heroes and geniuses and creative kings and queens in my life who had an open door regarding chemicals for me to be dumb enough to think that the only brilliant people out there or the only redeemable souls were people involved in straight edge. I mean, to this day, my favorite wordsmith ever to walk hard earth is Hunter S. Thompson, and rumor has it Thompson wasn't particularly straight.
No. Yeah. And that's one of those things too, like we can get into it too, like his writings and stuff when he rode with Hell's Angels and just kind of opening mainstream America to these different subcultures and stuff. And for me, I don't like that negative militant side to anything, no matter whether it's straight edge, whether it's politics, people's personal choices. Like, I think anytime you start to get in any extremes, left, right, whatever.
Well, have you ever heard of? I'm so sorry I interrupted your terrible habit. Have you ever heard of a band I did called Carrie Nation?
Yes. Yeah. I think I was going to ask you real quickly.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk.
Well, I mentioned Carrie Nation a minute ago.
Yeah.
Actually, but Carrie Nation, when we came back and did the band again in '89, we did it very specifically because of the militant turn that straight edge was taking. And to put it in context, everybody in Carrie Nation was over 6 feet tall, over 200 pounds, right? And had witnessed a great deal of violence in our lives firsthand, right? And we felt like all of a sudden, there was a lot of militant music coming out by 150-pound teenagers, who might as well have been singing about comic book superheroes because we knew these people. And this presentation had fuck all to do with what they were actually living and what they'd ever experienced. And so Carrie Nation, for all of its serious presentation and its heavy sound, wouldn't have existed if we didn't want to raise our hands and make fun of those people and make fun of militant straight edge, which is exactly what we did. I mean, and that crowd loves that record. But I'm like, read the fucking lyric sheet. Right. And the song, I think it's the song "Face the Nation," is just basically like, you preach conversion by the sword, but of a 5'5" horde. That's pretty fucking cold blooded,
Yeah,
it's not vague or masked,
Yeah. It's, to me, it's like the parallel or the comparison to what I used to say on the street was like the hijacking of hip hop. You know what I mean? Like,
sure,
like these gangster rappers that are singing about being in a gang, carrying a gun, selling drugs, and then it's all made up. It's all fictitious.
Yeah.
Sell records. The same thing. It's like, that whole movement of these kids that were straight edge that were like, not in my neighborhood, and we're going to push out all the drug dealers. We're going to beat them down. And it's like, okay, whatever. You're not going to convert anybody. Also, if you sit there and talk about fighting like that, somebody eventually is going to be like, all right, let's go. Like, somebody
scary or somebody not scary. Like, I'm not scary. There was a tour in 1997, just called the Revelation Tour. And it was a band I was in at the time called Speak. And it was Better Than 1,000, which was Ray Capo's band at the time, In My Eyes, and this band from DC called Battery. And you're out on that tour and you keep hearing about straight edge in Salt Lake City. That they're pinning people down on the ground outside McDonald's and carving X's in their backs and blah, blah, blah. And then we started hearing as Rev Tour got closer, as it's migrating west. And I used to drink at the time. I drank and Speak rather copiously, in fact. But we started hearing about how, when these guys get to Salt Lake City, or when Capo and O'Mahony get to Salt Lake City, and this and that and the other thing. We got to Salt Lake City, and during sound check, somebody told me that a bunch of those guys were outside. I walked outside, walked up to the group of them, put my arms around their shoulders. I was like, guys, I'm Dan O'Mahony. Just want to make sure you got a good look at my face in case we got anything we need to talk about. And they're all just sitting there not saying anything. I kind of shook their shoulders real hard, and I'm all, we good?
Yeah.
And walked back inside. They didn't even go to the show.
So was it true though? Or was that just like?
Well, they didn't seem to want anything to do with a mid-30s,
Yeah.
overweight version of me.
Yeah. Well, it's
And I mean, maybe those weren't the baddest man in the whole damn town. I don't know, but they were apparently. Folks had been talking because somebody came and got me and was like, "Hey, a moment's here."
Yeah, like the crew, like that was the crew they were known for.
And it turned out to be a complete non-moment.
Yeah. I think for probably, I don't know how many years it was, and I don't remember the exact time frame, because basically I can put on a timeline from about, I don't know, late 90s, 98, but then everything starts to become a blur on my timeline. But at one point when Boston got so hardcore, into the militant side of straight edge.
Well, I mean, that's post Slapshot? You're not talking about
No.
It's people after that. Like I think, was that the FSU type?
FSU,
Okay.
yeah.
Right.
So it's crazy because whatever year it was that I went through a course, general instructor course, and it's basically to teach people how to be instructors in law enforcement. And it's pretty cool because it's a pretty strenuous course, but you have to design your own course material and then present it. You do it under the clock for a certain time frame. If you go over or under by 3 minutes, you fail. I mean, it's pretty cool. But me being me, I've always been the type I want to change whatever I'm in, whatever job it is. I want to make it more efficient, be better. And in police work, it was like, I remember what it was like running from the police. I remember what it was like being dealt with unprofessionally, being pushed up against the wall, searched, and no one ever told me why or what was going on. I was 14, 15 years old. So I never wanted that for anyone in my city. So I went through this course.
Just to interrupt you with something about you. That's part of the reason I agreed to do this, is because I very much grasped that vibe in listening to your episodes. And after you suggested me coming on, I was like, I have a library and a litany and a lifetime of bad experiences with the police. And even coming from law enforcement, you seem to have a lot of those same experiences informing your perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. And to the point where when I told people I wanted to be a cop, some people were like, "You've lost your mind," and my true friends stuck around and my family supported me, but I knew down inside, like, okay, I can be the cop I want to be. And I'm pretty good at influencing people. If I see stupid stuff, I can address it. If for some reason the department I went to, if I saw corruption, then I'm going to, become Serpico. Like we're going to take them down. The fortunate thing is I never experienced anything like any type of police corruption on any kind of level like that. And I was always pretty proud of the department I was in. But when I was in this course and they're like, you got to pick out a topic to teach on or present on, I had like flashback to when I was in the academy and I had to correct an instructor about the whole skinhead movement. It was basically all skinheads are Nazis, blah, blah, blah. So I kind of hijacked that course in the academy during the presentation and was like, let me explain to you about, the real deal. So I designed a course in that class about the actual history of skinheads. And part of that, I covered just a small sliver of that FSU era in Boston where a kid actually got killed, basically getting mobbed and kicked to death. But to be able to explain to officers, if you hear straight edge or you see tattoos that are linked to straight edge or whatever, you're doing an investigation, understand those different kind of facets of it and stuff. So it was pretty cool. Like afterwards, the instructor was a retired NYPD cop, like grizzled, old school. And he was just like, hey, man, you need to really hone what you're doing. Like being able to teach it, this subculture, as you call it, from your point of view. He's like, you need to just do that for your entire career. So that was kind of like my eye opener. Like, okay, I can do this. So eventually I taught my entire department, the history and the background of it. And probably 99% of them had no clue. And we have such a huge, like just traditional or, regular skinhead movement in our area. We don't have like a lot of hammer skins or neo-Nazis and stuff. We're fortunate about that.
In
But
the
when
so I've always, people are always quick to forward that. It's a based in Jamaica, comes from, dance hall, ska, or reggae, or, I really don't know. I'm not, I've never been a skinhead, been bald, shaved my head for 11 years, but
yeah.
But I got to say one thing I've always wanted to point out to a lot of people my age that are sort of pretending like they've always had an affinity or a fondness for that skinhead culture.
Mm-hmm.
In mid 1980s Southern California, I'm sorry, the skinheads that you dealt with that were visible, they were Nazis. There was a gang mentality. They were rat packers at shows. They were the unsafe people. They beat dog shit out of me at the Olympic Auditorium at a show. And Sharp was later a visible presence of Sharp, or, like there was this gang called the South Bay Skins who were not a white power entity. That all came later. So seeing skinhead as being a negative or a weak-minded thing is not without cause. It's not a blind prejudice. My three fractures, including a floating rib from that night, tell me that.
Yeah. And that's my thing, is like to be able to assess something logically. And that's what that was part of the training, was understand the signs and symbols. Also understand people in their own mindset think they are correct in what they're doing, and they're using violence in order to obtain that goal. It does not mean that just because they're not neo-Nazis, or they align themselves with, straight edge or whatever, they can still be very capable of violence. Just understand during your investigation or your encounter, if you're a uniformed officer, like how to read those signs.
It seems to me that
deal with it, but
in your field, people willing to assume that level of authority owe themselves the specifics. And it seems to me like you took great care to provide the specifics. Yeah.
Well, the way I looked at it is, I have been chased. Like when you mentioned Sharp, for listeners, so y'all understand. I mean, now you can read it all over the internet, but years ago, nobody understood that there was a movement to fight back against Nazi skins, and it was, Sharp, skinheads against racial prejudice. But that whole thing, like, I had run from people before who thought I was a Nazi skinhead. Same thing, like you said, you shave your head. I mean, that was just, everybody was doing it at that time.
Well, we all wanted, in my case, we all wanted to look like Minor Threat.
Yeah, same thing here. It was like, you see a Minor Threat album, you're like, oh, this dude's got a bald head. And I have like a skater cut. And I mean, my hair is at the time like touching my chin, and I've got it shaved up on the sides. And I shaved my head. My brother had a mohawk. He shaved his head. Our buddy James basically had long, shaggy hair. He shaves his head, but leaves like a little devil's lock. I mean, it was just what everybody was doing. But when you say that about in my field, like knowing all of those things, like understanding every person you encounter, their attire, their clothes, how they talk, the things that they do, tells us, who they are. And to either, I don't know, offend people or step on their toes or completely misread a very violent crime and start to pursue leads that take you the wrong path can also lead to the wrong people being charged for a crime. And I always wanted to battle that. And I always wanted the best officers and detectives. And then later, halfway through my career, I started teaching on my days off all the material I was creating for gang investigations, developing informants, all that stuff, dismantling entire criminal organizations. Like, I wanted, agents, deputies, and officers in class to really just absorb all of it and be better at it like that. And one of those techniques, I actually bring gang members into the classroom, cover their face up, and that way they can explain their experiences to the officers and stuff. And man, I had a gang member call out a group. There was like 3 or 4 officers, and the gang member I was in a major city, but in the suburbs where he had grown up, and as a juvenile, he had been dealt with pretty harshly by those officers. So in class, he recognized them, even though his face is covered. They don't know who he is because he's now, he's an adult, and he points them and calls them out, how they treated him when he was a kid. And he and I, we still talk to this day. He and I talked later about that, and he was like, man, like that put me on that path. Like they basically let me know I'm the enemy, and their goal was to put me in prison by the time I was 16.
Well, and that's
horrible.
Put simply, that's a case of the supposed solution becoming the cause of the problem.
Yeah. And one of the things that I noticed when I first got on the department, I didn't let anybody know. Like I grew up listening to punk and skateboarding and stuff, or running from the same officers in the department that that when I was a kid. So I kept that kind of under wraps, and it wasn't until I started doing on the team, maybe a year or two in, you could get handpicked to do like a proactive team. You didn't respond to dispatch calls and stuff. You went after violent people in neighborhoods. And so we started, like, sometimes we wear regular clothes or what we call plain clothes. And so I'm rolling in there like wearing band t-shirts and stuff. And that was kind of when people started going, man, what the hell is all this about? And so I could kind of open the door a little bit. And
that evolution shows itself in any field, because it's funny, when I was a kid, and even 20 years ago, any affiliation to hardcore or punk rock rang, or probably more than 20, more like 30 years ago, but rang and landed in a completely different space than it does now. It doesn't disqualify you from anything now.
Yeah.
It is understood as the roots of what has become popular music. It occupies, punk rock occupies a completely different place in the lexicon than it did when it was a baby, just like rap does, just like a lot of things do. And I almost kind of miss the stigma. I did a certain amount of this to be shocking, damn it.
Yeah, that's like the running joke now is, I'll see kids and they'll have, the old school Finn Mohawk or Liberty Spikes or whatever. And then, they're doing their thing. That's what feels good to them. And it's funny because I think, like, man, that it's not shocking. It doesn't, I don't know. It lost that. And
my appearance got me in the most bizarre physical altercation I've been in my life in 1983 when I was attacked by 2 Marines in Irvine, California, because I was a punk fag. And that wouldn't happen now. They'd probably try to bro out and let me know that they listen to the same bands.
Yeah. Early on, I was a rookie, and it was a bunch of kids, whatever, doing stupid stuff. Nothing crazy. I was in a different part of the city than I worked in most of my career with gangs and stuff. But long story short, I saw a kid, and his hoodie was like halfway zipped down, and I saw that blue circle on a black t-shirt.
Wearing a germ shirt?
Yeah. I was like, hey, unzip your shirt. And I was playing up like the RoboCop, hey, unzip your jacket or whatever, and they do. And I just start messing around and asking about the germs. And then for like 20 minutes, we're talking about music. Same thing. They're very young. I mean, these are like 15, 16-year-olds. And my training officer, because I was a rookie, so you ride with the training officer for a couple of weeks. And he was just like, can we go? Like, basically, like, why are you keep talking to kids? Right. I was like, man, like, this is the best part of the job is meeting people and talking to people. I searched the car one time, same area. It was like a very northern part of the city, a lot of money, and then a few apartments here and there. But I stopped a car, I didn't know it was fully going on. And however it worked out, I can't remember all the details, but I ended up having to do basically like a car frisk, just looking for weapons, whatever. And so they're sitting, the occupants of the car sitting out on the sidewalk while I'm searching. I go back over there, and I'm like, hey, I'm here to tell y'all right now, I didn't find it, and I'm mad, but I really wish I would have found it. And they were just like, being real nice. Like, what's the matter, I said, I did not find, and this tells you how old it was, like the new Rancid CD. And I want y'all to go out and buy the new Rancid CD. And added that collection in there, and then they started kind of laughing. They realized I was just playing. And I told them that, I was like, hey, you guys did everything right. Just any of your encounters, remember that, we're all human beings. We want to go home at the end of the night. A lot of us are going to go through stuff that you have no clue. So just keep listening to that music, pay attention to it. And, and have a good life. You know,
Mhm.
it's one of those things. But there's a whole movement throughout the U.S. that's gone on for 20 years, and I didn't fully know that until I took a leap and I was a guest on a podcast a couple of years ago, and we were starting to figure out through social media, through Instagram. I was never a social media guy, never on Facebook, MySpace, any of that stuff, because my life was private, and the job I worked, I didn't think anybody needed to know, you know,
Right.
my face or name or any of that. So it wasn't until I started getting into writing and stuff that I used Instagram. And then I started seeing, like, every now and then, it was like this guy, Unit to Back, you know, this account, and he's posting like punk rock album art or like band logos, but he's altered them to kind of like a wink and nod to the police. So I responded to him, you know, like we just started chatting. He's like, yeah, I grew up skating, you know, I listen to punk. He's like, and now I'm a cop in you know, said area. And he was on a task force at the time. So he was going after, you know, gang members with guns. And we're just messaging back and forth. And he and I end up doing guest spots on this guy's podcast. It was all police related stuff. And the guy was like, man, after y'all's episode aired, I'm getting like just tons of people sending messages saying, hey, I'm in this, you know, small town or this city. I grew up the same way. No one else on my department listens to punk or hardcore or whatever. But now I kind of feel like, you know, I'm plugging in. Man, there are people out there that are chiefs, deputy chiefs, you know, that grew up in the same scene, listening to the same bands we're talking about and stuff. And they, through their careers, did the same thing, trying to change how police operate. You know?
Which strikes me as bizarre. Not them trying to make the changes, but that evolution, that personal evolution, I cannot entirely relate to it, which I think is one of the reasons it sounded like it'd be fun to do the podcast, you know, and I'm getting, it's an absolute gas talking with you.
Yeah.
You know, very similarly to, you know, my experiences with Nako Nolan, who you're familiar with. To me, psychologically, that is such a complicated thing and such a weird progression. And I don't want to get into it right now. What I'm doing is making sort of a heavy-handed invite. That's why I would like to talk to you on my show, and but almost exclusively about the personal evolution, the perspective. I need to know more about that happens, because
it's crazy,
because for me, a hardcore kid and a punk rocker and a cop are not the same person.
No,
and I'm smart enough to know that I like and trust the morality and trust the personal code of these guys I'm talking to, like you, like Nako, you know, like these people. So let's make sure we do that at some point.
Yeah, I'm always open for it. And when you had him on your episode, I was going to ask you, like, did you get a lot of pushback, or were people kind of like, you know?
So, and it's cool. I like talking about the podcast. It's weird because then you're talking about, because you're talking about talking, but but that episode was maybe, excuse me, one of the only episodes I ever went into where I expected a lot of negative feedback, and there were a couple snarky comments in comment sections in response to that. But the greater issue I had was before the episode. Like, why are you going to do that? You know, why are you going to talk to this person? You know, like I'm seen as being pretty left. I would like to think I'm an issues by issues guy. But by the same token, you know, I know my specific feelings about, you know, Ferguson, you know, about military surplus in domestic policing, about all these things. You know, I know where I stand on all these things. And there's an editorial choice made when you choose a guest. You're giving a forum to somebody, and there's always the chance that something will get out there that you don't like. And I had confidence in him as a person, that he would not embarrass me or make me regret the choice. I think, and this is something I wanted to get in while I was talking to you, and I don't want this to become an interview about policing. For one thing, it pigeonholes you. But I will say, like the phrase that, you know, however you pronounce the acronym, but all cops are bastards is not what I'm about. For the simple reason that it's naive and it's simplistic into anything revolutionary, anything counterculture, anything like that, other than for marketing purposes. To oversimplify or to be naive or to dumb things down does not serve the advancement of the thought. It's a fucking idiotic notion. Absolutism doesn't play with me. Maybe in terms of racism, maybe in terms of rape, whatever. But in
Yeah.
terms of classifications of people, it's horseshit. You
It's
know, I can't go with it. The
Yeah.
other thing, the other thing is that if you cannot humanize people in a completely different space, then you have no future interacting with other people.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
Yeah. I do the exact same thing when I'm trying to explain to people to keep an open mind in general. Hell, I get it. Well, look, I had Danny Boy O'Connor on the show a while back.
House of Pain guy.
House of Pain. Yeah.
Okay.
But he's old school punk rock. Like grew up listening to punk like
most decent music from a certain side of the tracks will eventually trace back to punk rock.
Yeah. Yeah. He was giving me a hard time because of my accent. And I get it. I knew it. I didn't know how I sound different until I went in the Army, and then everybody made fun of me. So the rest of my life, I knew as soon as I opened my mouth, people are going to judge me, and they're going to think either, Beverly Hillbillies type stuff if they're, a little older, or, depending on where they're from, they're just like, who is this like hillbilly kid or whatever? I don't know. So I've always kind of looked at things, at least from other people's perspectives, and how they're perceiving me.
Right.
Like I get it. And the way I look, and
I mean, it's kind of, I don't know, man, you get to use it as a little bit of a secret weapon. Cause I mean, it softened things. If I were talking to you and you sounded like Sergeant Rock, we might not have as much fun.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, because in the Army that you do have like these strong, Southern, like drill sergeants and stuff sometimes are from the South. But it was weird that once I got to my unit, there were people from all over the world. Like 10% of my platoon they were not even American citizens. They were born in other countries, came to America at some point in their life, joined the military, and then were working on getting their citizenship. So, I mean, that was like huge. I talk about it all the time, but I mean, that was a huge eye opener for me. But to have like people hearing me and then immediately thinking I'm completely an idiot, like they're surprised I can read and write. I'm going,
right.
I don't, but you're right. I use it to my advantage. I know when to nerd it up and need to soften things.
I don't doubt it. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, let's make sure we do that. It would be almost entirely a podcast about mindset, which I hope you wouldn't mind, but that would be a good time.
Man, look, when I got out of the Army, I went to college, and everybody was like, because the Army paid for it. UPS, I was working at UPS. UPS was paying for it, and people were like, "Oh, if you want to be a cop, be a criminal justice major." It's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I dig this psychology stuff. Like, I like how people act.
Right.
So I got a degree in psychology because I love it. I do love the mindset. I do love the ability that people sometimes can set a goal and accomplish it, small or large.
So like motivation and the way life events affect people's or inform people's life choices and life paths are what is fascinating to me and what I enjoy about podcasting. It's, I think, why I do it, and why, like a conversation you and I had off air, but I'm very rarely interested in people's war stories. I'm more interested in what got them to that space.
Yeah, and you've got guests on there. The thing that I love too is that on your show you'll have guests, that are in bands. Then you've got like journalists and reporters, and to me, that's what I start to find myself drawn to. Same thing, you said. Yeah.
So here's an interesting thing. I stopped doing the podcast for about 2 years, and it had largely to do with the fact that my father was in sort of the end stages of his life. And I was a financial provider and caregiver to him. And then there was the management of his estate after that. And there was the accompanying depression and everything that goes with that, which is neither your problem nor the reason you wanted to talk. Well, but what's interesting about coming back to it is I also had Dan talks to another aging white punker fatigue. In other words, it's like, how many more 55-year-old white men am I going to talk to? And I have a bunch of great 55-year-old white men lined up to talk to in the upcoming season.
Yeah.
But I'm going to what you're talking about, which is that, man, you get a chance to talk to an epidemiologist during the pandemic. You get a chance to talk to a reporter who's been embedded in the Middle East. You get a chance to talk to somebody who was investigating, murders post Katrina in New Orleans. Yeah. That's exciting shit. It's hard to come by. Like, somebody was willing to finance my attempts to get Angela Davis, Black Panther, educator, Black Panther, and I was ghosted. So far I've been unsuccessful in getting a hold of her. The out of the box guests, which is why I made sure to work into our conversation, getting somebody on there. The out of the box guests are not the ones that get your numbers, but they're the ones that you grow the most from talking to. Like I'm going to have this fellow named Spencer Ackerman on my show, and it's going to be the third time I've had him on. Spencer is the author of a book called Reign of Terror, which is about 9/11, and it's paving the way for the Trump administration. He's also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's done all these things. I'm not talking this to talk up, but now he writes comic books. He's still a reporter. And we're going to do an episode that I think he might be in the Middle East right now. He might be somewhere in some hotspot in Eastern Europe. But the next time he comes on the show, we're going to do an episode entirely about him writing fucking Iron Man. Because he works for Marvel. How great is that? Yeah. Because he works for Marvel, and it's just it's an opportunity.
Yeah. And I love that. I think that, I was messaging a guy earlier today, and just the idea of, I grew up sitting around talking to people. Like my parents were that way. My wife is that way. She is the exact version of me. We literally talk for hours at a time. We've been known to sit in a parking lot, to go into a grocery store, be in the middle of a conversation. 20 minutes later, we see one of our neighbors, and he's waving at us going, "What are y'all doing?" We're still talking. But I love that. But so the podcast allows me to ask people, "Hey, will you come on the show?" And technically, I can just have a conversation the way when I was a kid, we would have in a parking lot somewhere,
right?
Or my dad, come Saturday afternoon, we would work all day. I always worked when I was a kid. We'd go hang out at one point for, I don't know, one summer. He had a guy that was, in a motorcycle club when he was younger, got into some trouble, stole an airplane. He was wild, but he was in his 50s or something by the end of 60s, slowing down a little bit. And all these adults would sit around and drink and tell stories about running moonshine and the early days of NASCAR. And I'm taking it all in.
It sounds like heaven listening to that shit.
Oh my God. I loved it. So there's even a splinter of the Disruptors that I want to start doing that is just me talking to people I grew up with, or the characters that my wife and I encounter. Because she's got the same ability and the same love of talking to people. And I joke about, man, we were on a walk. We walk every day. And we'll cover about 6 miles. So where we live, we could walk down to this riverfront. It's amazing. But I mean, we met a dude one day just walking. He was doing yard work in his 60s. We just say, hey, talk for about 2 or 3 minutes. Then we realize we're talking for 4 or 5. By about 10 minutes in, this guy is telling me all about how he was a former cocaine trafficker and how he could run coke up the coast. And he talked about, and then, and of course,
I take it you didn't introduce yourself as Officer Sanders.
This is the funny thing. He just starts to tell us about this, and he's laughing because the house he's doing the yard work at, he had inherited through a death, I think, if I remember right. But he was still in his early 60s, I think, or late 50s when he was bringing coke in. But he was also so exhausted and strung out and high, he wasn't in his own mind. And he set his burglar alarm off in his house. So the police responded to the alarm and realized he had, some other issues going on, and they end up finding a key or two of coke. And he's just like, I'm an idiot, I got busted, my dumb ass, and he's just this crazy character. And so for a while, on our walks, we'd stop by and say hey to him, and he'd tell us a new story. And he told us about a buddy of his that got pinched down in Peru loading up some car full of coke, and door panels.
You gotta track that dude down and have him on. But I've seen seen your list of guests. There's some great stuff there.
I love it. I love that. And we joked about it. And I did. Eventually in the conversation, he said, well, now what kind of line of work are y'all in? Basically y'all are just out walking around, with nothing to do. And so we tell him, and I told him, I said, man, I was on the other end, buddy. I just retired.
Right.
And I said, and I told him my background. He started laughing. That's funny. He said, I bet you're really good at what you did. And I told him that. I said, I was, man. If I ran into a dude like you, we'd be working together. You know what I mean? You would get yourself out of this jam, but you would also help me get some really violent people if you were able to do it. And you'd be good. You'd roll on about your life.
It's a pretty good example of how dialogue and discourse just creates better space,
Yeah.
That said, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about some things. I'm like, well, Brian has given me a great opportunity to talk about something I'm passionate about and kind of put some things out there, whether you ask about them or not. So I hope you don't mind.
No, do it.
What you're just talking about being able to have conversations in other spaces. One of the great frustrations in podcasting for me, I've had people get a hold of me, say, hey, where are the women at on this show? Where is the racial representation of other different people? And this is something I'm saying we own from this end. We own to whatever degree we own the sins of our own demographic. The hardest guests for me to get and the lowest rate of response I get is from Black guests that I reach out to, right? And from women. I have gotten more non-responses from invitations to people who I've crossed paths with in life. Women, people of other races. And I sit back and I think about that and I come to this conclusion, 250-pound tattooed white boy, you may not be the portrait of trustable figures. You may not represent a library of great experiences in their lives.
And isn't that sad?
Well, it's sad, but I don't put that on them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
At some point I had to gee, why don't any girls want to be on my show? I needed to hope it wasn't my gap teeth and accept that it might be something else.
Yeah. I think this is the funny thing. I talk about this a lot about growing up where I grew up. And my high school was about 60% white, 40% Black. We didn't have racial fights or whatever. People weren't drawing the line in the sand then. It was basically probably the greatest era in the sense of music that's so important to teenagers. At that time, mainstream kids were just starting to get introduced to Yo MTV Raps. So some of these kids were starting to listen to music outside of whatever had been kind of put in their hand. But and for whatever reason, maybe that was part of it. But man, it just wasn't that way. And then going into the Army and showering, there's something about the first day you get to a strange place and people are yelling, grown men are yelling at you. And then at the end of the first day, you're buck naked, all in a shower, and everybody is a different skin tone.
So maybe a little more nudity between me and these prospective guests might make things happen.
Well, I say
no. I see what you're talking about is it's reducing people down to their shared elements. You know what I mean?
That's the thing. It to me, when I reach out to people, and I know what you're saying. When I reach out to people and say, "Hey, do you want to be on the show?" I don't think about it in that perspective, because growing up, it was that. In the Army, you proved yourself through your skills. In college, you're an individual, you get good grades, you learn your material, and you move on. In the police world, most of my career was dealing with gangs and homicides and intel work and stuff like that. So I always felt rewarded, but I was always dealing with, for the most part, Black men and women, and then probably for a while there, a lot of Hispanic gangs, and then Hispanic families that are getting victimized. But that was also during that era, man, where it felt like there was a shift in America and that people were openly being prejudiced.
Mhm.
and a lot of it was geared towards white males, and it was weird. I was scratching my head like, man, am I watching a Twilight Zone episode? Because this feels like people were saying white males are inherently racist, and I couldn't dig that. I couldn't understand that, because not while I don't walk around like, oh, I'm a white male, but people
Well,
would look at me and be like,
well,
that's a
I'll gi-
white dude, like he must be
well,
inherently
well,
racist.
let me give you a counter thought. And I'm
Uh-huh.
certainly not going to tell you that being white makes you inherently racist.
Uh-huh.
I will say that unless you commit a great deal of effort to making it otherwise,
Mhm.
privilege does breed ignorance, which is an
Mhm.
entirely different thing. Which is
Yeah.
if you grow up safe and you
Mhm.
grow up provided for, unless you choose to educate yourself and unless you choose to expose yourself to something else, you are going to be ignorant to the psychological realities of somebody who grew up in an opposite space.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh,
Yeah.
and that's the funny
And that to a large extent is at the core, in my opinion, of white fear and white resentment and of identity politics, which are very fancy names for racism.
yeah.
You know?
And I think the problem is when people will blatantly categorize, like you said earlier, broad brush, all cops are bastards. It's stupid. They're not.
Mhm.
There's a sliver of them though, boy, that they need to be fired, indicted, or
And that's where you
But-
and I would start to get into a larger back and forth. Is we probably differ on whether or not it's a sliver, but we agree on the reality that the notion,
Yeah.
that the notion that there are not good and bad within the police force is ludicrous.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's just ignorant to think that.
Yeah. But back to like when you're talking about guests, one of the perspectives that a guy told me is, he said, I don't want to be the voice of all black men. He's like, so anything that I say is going to come through that filter that, oh, he represents whatever, black men. He's like, no, I'm me. Everything I got, I earned. I owe nothing to anybody else, and my viewpoint is me. But there's a lot of pressure, as he put it, a lot of pressure, which will be peer to peer, of people telling him, don't be a sellout. When you talk about this, you're making it bad for everybody else. And he's expressed that, and I'm like, okay, I get it. But you can also preface it and say, I only speak for myself. I think there is a lot of like interpersonal pressure that people put when they put themselves in a category.
Right.
And that was the cool thing about meeting people in my city, because I was born and raised in the same city I worked in. And the best part about it is local history and knowing, man, there are families that are millionaires, and it's because they were able to have the trade they wanted, whatever that trade is, pay off the house they're in, and then the next generation comes in, and then this one already has a house that's paid off, and then they sell it, or they buy up houses down the street. There was a dude I used to deal with. He drove a pickup truck, and he's an older black guy, and he had properties everywhere.
Right.
And that was his thing, was like, I don't get caught up in any of this. I never have. He's like, in this city, I could buy houses and I could sell them. He's like, and that's what I do. He's like, I don't get caught up in the drama. And where he was, there were multiple, homicide shootings. He came, he was buying property during, the crack epidemic for that city was in the early 90s. He was just like, man, I'm about myself, and that's what I stay focused on. And it's strange, like when I can get really cool perspectives like that from people.
Right.
But if I share them, I have been told too as well, like, well, you can't understand. And I'm like, no, I'm sharing his perspective, how he succeeded. He didn't get caught up on race. He didn't. He was small enough to remember when, schools were segregated in that same city.
One of the easiest ways to impress me as an interviewer, right, is when a guest catches me off guard with an unexpected moment of humility, where when the perspective that they're sharing to me, when the wisdom that they're imparting to me has to do with them becoming aware of their own bullshit, or if not their own bullshit, maybe just of the way that they're perceived, You know, like I'll sit here and think I know what someone's about, and it turns out that they know I think that. You know, that's always like, aha. You know.
Well, I think a lot. And that sounds dumb. That's like one of those dumb quotes. But there are people that don't. You know what I mean? Like there are people that just kind of go through life and they don't do just like what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So they could go through life and let's say they're a white guy and they've been fortunate to live in a safe neighborhood. They golf on the weekends, whatever. And they can say stuff that to me, I'd be like, well, that sounds pretty ignorant or stupid or whatever, because they don't do just what you were talking about. They're not internalizing, or they're not taking in what's going on around them. And because they never have had to do that.
Right.
I think that's kind of the cool thing is like, you know, seeing all these different aspects of success where, just like I said, the guys, because driving around in a pickup truck, most people would just be like, oh, he's broke. Or, you know, I would see it with younger guys clowning each other. And if somebody tried to follow that goal they set in their head, people would clown them. I mean, there's a Dave Chappelle skit about that, about a guy getting a job at McDonald's and everybody's clowning him. But it's one of those things where, I don't know, man. I think about these things and all of these different people and perspectives that I've encountered. And at the root of it, I always look at when racism has divided, I think, America, probably, this sounds dumb, and this is one of those where people would absolutely want to just destroy me on the keyboard, you know. I would say America's view of race and racial identity is so divisive right now, it would probably mimic what it was like in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Oh, well, I'm sure two middle-aged white men sitting here on a podcast, we're going to fix all that. So don't worry.
That's my point.
Yeah, no,
that's
I'm
my
kidding.
point. Yeah.
No, but
it's the best part. Yeah, that's the best part about it is like people would go.
The only thing you and I can do in this situation, and you know, our lives are so very different, but the only thing we really bring to the table in this situation, other than responsibility for our own behavior, is self-examination and self-awareness. You know what I mean? Like I interviewed this woman, Shauna Potter, from a band called War on Women. And one of the great gotcha moments for me, and I forget exactly what dynamic and what sort of, if you want to call it protected class, or what class, or what group of people who were sort of definitely on the getting the fuzzy end of the lollipop that we were talking about. But I said, what can you do, or what do you do in that situation? And she's all, I listen.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is somebody I'm expecting to be the woman warrior, or just the warrior, and the lady, and the voice of the offense of attack. And she was saying her great weapon at times, the way I translated it is her great weapon at times is just the willingness or the availability to learn.
Yeah. I don't ever want someone to see me and think something, immediately think negative, and that it be tied to pigment. I get
mistaken to this day, and it may be my choice in terms of style of tattoos, it may be my physical dimensions. I routinely, over the last 20 years, get mistaken for someone somehow attached to the Nazi movement or to the white power movement. To me, I don't look that part. You know, I don't have the grooming discipline, as you can see, you know. I don't have the part, but perception is massive. And I don't know to what degree I have to take responsibility for it, but if I try to make, there's an interesting thing about psychology, which is how do you care for others people's perception without spoon feeding or without condescending? And it's almost instinctive. Like in the restaurant industry, if a table has a complaint, right? There are certain tables I will go up to the table, and rather than, I'm standing there seating, I will kneel next to the table to talk to them, to sort of reduce my physical presence and my size and the way they perceive me. But there are also tables where if I kneel, they know what I'm doing and they find it condescending. If I take a knee next to the table to talk to them. So like human interaction is so fucking complicated.
It is. And I think that at the root of it, your heart is in the right place. You're doing what you're trying to make the experience better for somebody else.
Mhm.
So, and you're right. It's kind of like that damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right.
I always look at it that way. Like my heart is right. I'm doing things to try to make things better,
Mhm.
or to try not to offend you. But now it's almost like it's gotten into the point where people sometimes want to be offended. I'm talking about a different thing, not your
Yeah.
examples, but where they want to be offended. And it comes from if they know whatever, a political background or a political affiliation, which is the scariest thing that I've seen over the last probably, I don't know, 5-6 years, where people will, once they make it known whatever their political view is,
Mhm.
that's the line. It's like, okay, it's us versus them. So now I know this person said they are a Republican, or this person said they're a Democrat. Now I can't like them.
See, I find that complicated, and
Uh-huh.
I've two close friends who immediately spring to mind. One I know through music, one I know through restaurants, who would define themselves as conservatives, at least fiscally, if nothing else. But I suspect I know their voting patterns, and it bothers me tremendously.
Mhm.
My interaction with them goes deeper than that, but kind of a counterpoint to what you're saying. Yeah, dialogue is necessary. Dialogue maybe gets to sand off the sharp edges and move the whole body politic towards a more manageable, more peaceful coexistence. But I've got to tell you, talking about extremes on the left and extremes on the right, for me, I wouldn't feel good if I didn't say, and we talked about maybe going or not going into this and whether we were not. I don't equate the opposing extremes. I think it's a false equivocation. To me,
Mhm.
the extreme right and now increasingly so via people like Musk and things like that, the extreme concentration of wealth, the tendency towards just historically proven oligarchical practices, the refusal to acknowledge the existence of different classifications beyond simple race and gender is not the same as being a communist or as being a practiced anti-fascist. I do not say that these are morally identical opposite ends of the same teeter-totter. I flatly reject that. There
Mhm.
is acting in the interest of human beings, and there is acting again, and there is in the interest of all human beings, and there is acting in the interest of selected groups. And I opt
Mhm.
for the former and reject the latter. Now, 50 years ago, to
Mhm.
talk about the Republican and the Democratic Party, I wouldn't have said the same thing,
Yeah.
because you were more dealing with tax policy. You were
Mhm.
more discussing, military involvement or budget practices, things like that. This is a culture war, and I do pick this. Okay, this feels like a culture war. This teeters
Yeah.
on culture war,
Yeah.
and I do have a side. I
Mhm.
just I paying homage to my people who pushed back on my Naco episode, but paying homage to my years on the staff at Maximum Rock and Roll. I do lean in a chosen direction.
Yeah. But the thing is, you're right. I think it's a culture war as well.
Mhm.
I love reading about history. Um I say I love it, but also it's scary because it does really kind of repeat itself where you see these cycles.
Mhm.
And I think that we are living right now. You and me are in an era
Mhm.
that is probably very similar to when my dad got out of the army
Mhm.
and came back to the US. And he
Mhm.
and he was just like, dude, I didn't know what was going on. He's like, people were
Right.
tripping on acid. The monkeys it's like a TV show and they're all moving fast. He's like, I don't know what any of that's about.
Right.
Like he could not, like it just was like being on a foreign planet to him. And that, you read
Mhm.
literature about it and movies are made about it.
Mhm.
But there were those two polar opposites. And we
Yeah.
saw what happened in government when polar opposites were going on
Well,
like that.
isn't it fascinating that it seemed like their big beef between the opposite ends of the political spectrum then was Vietnam?
Yeah.
And while
Yeah.
people fall on different sides regarding Ukraine, and you can't equivocate all wars with each other, it seems like much more of the tension is based within our own four walls now, within the borders of our own country. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? The big thing that has people not being able to talk to somebody has a red hat on a bar stool not being able to talk to a Fugazi fan, is not the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's the evolution of American society and of our own cultural interaction.
Yeah, I think that Vietnam was their line of whatever demarcation because of the draft. That was the thing. Like if you were, you're 18 years old and you're going, I don't know what's going on in Vietnam, and now I'm going to have to go fight for something I have no clue. And you may be, getting told by your peers, hey, there's really bad stuff going on over there. You know what I mean? Like that. Like
it wasn't we call this the information age because things are so immediately available to us digitally.
Mm-hmm.
But what's funny is, for the first few years, but now disinformation is more readily available.
Yes,
to a horrifying degree, and I don't know how we peel that back.
I have thought about that too. You study like psychological operations, same thing in Vietnam. Like that was when I was a kid, I read books about PSYOPs and the Phoenix program and stuff going on in Vietnam and counterinsurgencies and these sort of things. And now it's like propaganda and disinformation. It's at an all-time high. And maybe a younger generation will be able to navigate it a little better, or maybe even unplug somewhat completely.
Yeah.
Maybe there'll be a movement, a straight edge technical movement where they're like, I'm not going to have a phone, or I'm not going to buy into this social media stuff. I'm going to read books and enjoy the weather.
Hail the coming of Luddite core.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, because
might not be a bad thing, my friend,
Yeah. I can tell you that, man, like this is the power of technology. Me and you talking in two different places, seeing each other talking. The only thing that would be better is if we were sitting in the room just hanging out and talking. I
keep hoping 50 pounds from now and some source of 50 pounds of weight loss and some source of financial backing. Someday I can sit on a set dressed like Danny Ocean and interview whoever the fuck I want.
Right.
But until then, these platforms where you and me and our mics and our laptops are able to knock it out across the country is amazing.
Yeah, it is. And that I only use really Instagram. I don't need to use any other platforms.
I'm not a big fan of the owners of any of them, but it is dangerously close to being a necessity to promote and to share any self-created media.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the double-edged sword because I didn't know what I was missing necessarily. It's like when I started writing articles and stuff, this guy's like, you've got to get Instagram at least. You got to find a way you can network because you're writing articles, basically just they're historical articles, but you can network with people, man. It's incredible. And that's how I started using it. And I'm like, and you can, I'm an artist at heart. I took like 4 years of art in high school and I loved it. So there is that aspect of it. So there are times when I used to do like a little more artistic post, or I might write a little better in like a caption. Now I use it more for like that, like a direct message, or to take in stuff and watch some reel of an interview and go, man, I need to check out that full episode. Or someone like Nako, I never met that cat, man. Like, how would I have ever crossed paths?
You want to hear a funny story about Nako? I interrupted you, so please finish the thought.
Dude, that's how I talk to. I love conversation.
Okay.
You interrupt all you want to.
So in podcasting, it took me so long to learn respond late. This is my trick. I won't come in right when the thought hits me. I'll wait until I'm almost too late to bring it up, and then I'll get in there, because that way I usually give them time to finish, even though the guest just said something where I went. Something comes out of their mouth, and I have this holy shit moment and want to know more about it. And I'm like, hold back, Dan. Just sit there. Wait them out. But then when I'm a guest on people's shows, I fuck that all up. Like I just did just now.
I love it.
Nako, do you remember that? It's not the Chelsea Hotel, but there was some Netflix documentary.
Yes, it was.
I think it's another name, but anyway, about some old hotel in Hollywood that people are trying to decide whether or not it's haunted, and they found, a dead girl floating in the water tower, and right?
Yeah.
Well, Nako Nolan used to go to pretty much every Shiners Club show. Nako Nolan is a retired chief of LAPD detectives, right? He's one of the first owners of a Shiners Club T-shirt. Was good friends with Doug McKinnon, our drummer. Used to show up everywhere. We used to basically have a crew that we could count on to be at every one of our, shows for me, the first 10 shows we played, right? And he was one of them. He was great to talk to. We had this running joke that he was John Coyle, the guitar player's personal security guard, and this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
I didn't know Nako was a cop. I thought Nako was a martial arts instructor. Yeah. Until I was sitting on Netflix and he starts talking about this goddamn hotel murder. Like, I'm sitting in my living room and all of a sudden the guy who I saw last Saturday night in my band's T-shirt and we were talking about, spin kicks is on TV. And that goes to the notion that you are not necessarily what you do for a living. You are how you treat it. You are how you treat and interact with other people.
Dude, it's the best compliment I ever got from people was when they would say, "Cop, a cop? Like I never would have thought you're a cop." I'm like, good. Because what does that mean? It's more
to me, what they're saying is you are not what they think of cops.
Yes. Yeah. This is the funny thing. So that's how, I knew about Carrie Nation and other bands from childhood. Right. Nako's the one that put me on Shiners Club.
Yeah.
And then I think on that same maybe record label,
that's that band is how he and I met. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But so he's the one that told me about it. And I was like, I went ahead and ordered the record. You know what I mean? Like that.
You know what's trippy about Shiners Club? For all these we're talking all this cultural advancement and people understanding. That is the angriest, most unforgiving, shittiest, apolitical, personal gripe grievance band I've ever done. It is just 12 songs of "you hurt me and you need to go fuck a horse," but it's birthed some beautiful things.
Hey, you probably needed that, right? Like that was a perfect...
at the time somebody had hurt me and they needed to go fuck a horse.
Yeah. So a funny story about Nako. This is so check this out. So this book right here.
Okay.
It's written by James Patterson and Matt Eversman. Mm-hmm. But they went around interviewing cops all over the U.S. Mm-hmm. And Nako's got a section in there, and I've got a section in there.
That's crazy.
It's so crazy that our names somehow were thrown in the hat, and then we get in, and that's like our running joke is like, how great is that? We both end up in the same book. There's multiple sections on other cops, but like my section starts out talking about riding around in my buddy's milk truck with Minor Threat and Dead Kennedys like stenciled on the side of it, and just what life was like. But he at some point early on when I got on Instagram, we crossed paths, and I can't remember how, but it was like one of the first conversations I remember having and actually telling somebody else, hey, in full disclosure, like I'm a cop.
Right.
And same thing on because I think openly he was acknowledging that he was in law enforcement. And anyway, with the music background, and man, that's all we ever talked about was music and him growing up in New York and books and he's just a cool cat, man. And I was at a H2O Lagwagon and I think it was Face to Face show a couple of years ago, and I was talking to H2O's guitarist Rusty. Mm-hmm. And he's just like, man, you remind me like the way you're passionate about music and police work and life. He's like, you remind me of, man, you remind me of, and it was Nako.
Yeah, what's funny, he's agreed. When I told somebody I was doing this interview, told one of my best friends that I was prepping for an interview this week. He's all, oh, so Nako's doing a podcast? And I was all, no, Nako is not doing a podcast. Damn it, Brian is his own man. When I look at some of the people you got a firefighter almost immediately after the Palisades fire, didn't you?
Yeah.
Who was in it? God damn.
Who happened? I
am so jealous of things like that, man.
Well, I'll tell you what. It's like this, man. This is crazy. So I knew a dude that was SF. He's a Green Beret. We crossed paths back.
SF is in Special Forces, not San Francisco.
Special Forces. Yeah. Okay.
So we crossed because fuck the Niners. But anyway,
I forget. West Coast. But we had crossed paths a while back when I was writing articles and stuff. And this guy back then was like, "Hey, I grew up in the punk and hardcore, and I think it was like a Arizona or somewhere." And we were talking about going to go see, we were kids seeing Bad Brains live and all this cool talk. And then at some point he said, "Hey, you need to check out a buddy of mine. He works on basically like an ambulance crew, like an EMS crew." He's like, but he was the drummer for the Lillingtons. I'm like, okay. So I check out the Lillingtons.
I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, so I was like, all right, this is cool, and anyway, so then I started following that dude on Instagram.
Right.
And it's Tim O'Hare. I reach out to Tim and I'm like, "Hey, dude, would you want to be a guest? You got this background with this ambulance crew, but you were also a drummer in the Lillingtons." And he's like, "Yeah, let me tell you why I'm no longer in a band at that time." And so I had him on the show, and he talked all about watching. They were on tour, and he watched a car crash at like 3 a.m. And their bus they were riding around in, they pull over, and they're in the middle of nowhere, and he runs out. And because he had been a Boy Scout as a kid, he kind of knew the basics for like treating shock.
Right.
But he's trying to treat this woman's injuries, and she's saying, where's my husband? Where's my husband? And then he realizes the husband's like pinned under the vehicle. And then he finds out later the husband passed away. And it messed with him. And at that time he was just a punk rock dude, on tour. And he said, "Man, like I didn't want to be that anymore. I never wanted to not know how to save someone." And so he then pursued a career like getting on an ambulance crew, and then now he's a firefighter. And he's the one that introduced me or posted
to the other fella. Okay.
About Brent. Yeah. And Brent's band, Taking Days, they're playing shows, and he grew up in the scene, and he's, fire captain and was in the Palisades Fire, and just a great conversation. And what does he do? He puts me on to a band, Chaser, which is another punk rock band, and the lead singer is a firefighter.
Shiners Club played with them. Yeah, I think.
Oh, okay, cool.
I think they played with us and Pennywise in Big Bear, No, maybe in Santa Cruz. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess I just ask anybody and talk to anybody, and it's a little easier now because I can just send somebody a clip and say, "Hey, here's the podcast. Here's kind of some of the idea about guests."
Well, it's like the space between you and I, right? Punk rock opens that door, or hardcore. More realistically, between you and I, hardcore opens that door, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of your guests, and I see that. I see the musicians on your podcast. Your career also opens doors. Unfortunately for me, my other career is in running bars and in running restaurants, and I don't give a fuck about talking to other bar or restaurant managers, with the possible exception. I think I'd like to interview Alex Hernandez from Alex's Bar in California. It's the hub of live music in my part of the world. But beyond that, it's like, I'm jealous. I'm jealous of some of your ins. Again, you get to interview. It's a more interesting box, I think, for the average person on the street.
So one way, and you're right. So another path that I've had people on, like I had an undercover detective. He worked Nazi Skinhead Crew. He introduced me to a guy because we had built rapport, and he trusted me. He introduced me to a guy who I've had on the show.
You're talking about Eric Hebert? Or?
Yes, yeah, man, great. I mean, that guy, we text a lot, and it's messed up right now because we try to squeeze in phone calls when we can, but we get on the phone and talk for 2 or 3 hours, and we don't get anything done. But
right,
man, I mean, his perspective in life and just the things he's doing and just trying to be positive and make ends meet. It opens my eyes, but it also opens a lot of other people's eyes. And I think when people hear Eric talking, it should at least hit them in the heart to be like, okay, as a society, sometimes we got to step back. And even in the moment when there's a heinous crime and it can be attempted murder or anything like that, like we got to step back and also look at the age of the offender, the motivation.
On paper, that dude is the last human being you would ever want to have a conversation with.
Right.
What I mean? But that was then.
Yeah. And I've been told too that like I would talk to an active Hammerskin right now. You know what I mean? Only because I would want to know their perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did that in my job, but
Yeah.
but those are different things too. And sometimes you can slowly influence some people to see things differently. But usually, it seems to be anybody in an extreme racist organization that commits
Mm-hmm.
violence, that organization itself has to kind of betray them somehow, or they have to realize they're in, the lion's den, and eventually they're going to be eaten by their own.
Yeah.
And maybe they start to change,
Right.
But at every turn, I always have the mindset that I love talking to people, and as long as I'm not, hurt, or no one else is hurt by it, they're just words. And I can disagree with people all day long,
Mm-hmm.
and they can disagree with me, but it doesn't mean now we got to draw a line in the sand and fight.
Right.
And I think that's where, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that's what hurts my heart the most, is when people will openly post things, and basically, and kind of what's going on now, because we're in the weeks after the inauguration, and people are drawing the line in the sand and basically saying, if you voted for Trump, I'll no longer talk to you, or and I'm kind of condensing it, but this idea of that.
I virtually never rule out conversation. Despite the little tirade I gave earlier, making sure I wanted to be in this space and identify sort of my posture. Nonetheless, a deaf ear and a silent tongue is horseshit. I mean, there's one of those things I hashtag most of my social media posts with, is the hashtag silence lies.
Okay. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean shut up lies, like stop lies. It means silence itself lies. It misrepresents reality.
Do you think that if, let's say, you've got a friend and y'all live in the same area, and they say, I can't be your friend, I can't talk to you more, I don't want anything to do with you, basically you're the enemy, because you didn't vote for Trump. My thing is like, well, what happens then? Like, this was a person that you did get along with before, but now they've drawn this hard line in the sand.
Kick rocks. You're responsible for your response, and they'll tell you why. Because you're responsible for your own behavior, and they're the one rejecting me.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? And it sounds like unless our friendship wasn't particularly substantive, it sounds like the work to be done is between them and the mirror.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I have a friend. I have a friend. They say there's no such thing as an ex-Marine, so I won't say he's
right. Yeah.
An ex-Marine. I'll say I have a Marine Corps friend who runs sports bars.
Yeah, there you go.
I have a middle-aged Marine friend who votes to the right and runs sports bars. His son is in the active military, and their family is decidedly conservative. They have a 30-foot flagpole in the front lawn type group of folks, right? If he had rejected any further contact between the two of us because of our political differences, I would find it painful. I would find it hurtful. It would be a bummer, right?
Yeah.
But I would still say it's on him. I wouldn't crawl over very much broken glass to try and repair that. That doesn't mean I don't want to do my part to narrow the cultural divide. It's more, physician heal thyself, or as verbal assault says, rebel heal thyself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look at it like,
and that is something that hasn't happened. We just addressed a hypothetical. Dude's name is Daryl, and he and I can sit through the worst Raider games in history and still find a smile.
Yeah. It's one of those things that, I don't know, 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, I don't think it was as big of a deal. Now where I grew up, it's more of like a cultural thing. You did not talk about politics. I never remember a lot of adults talking about politics. As a matter of fact, the saying was basically that if you bring it up, you get a mouthful of busted chiclets. I'm like, okay, so, and probably the only time I really remember it being an issue was like Reagan and Carter.
Mhm.
you know, because that seemed to be, even for back then, some polar opposites there, you know.
I mean,
But man, huh?
No, go on.
Yeah, but I'd say,
That's the bad habit right there.
nah, but so growing up, like then, my introduction into politics was Dead Kennedys. It
Mhm.
was like listening to Dead Kennedys albums when I'm in 5th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th grade,
Mhm.
and not even fully understanding who Jerry Brown is or anything. But I just know, like, man, this is eye opening. These things that, you know, this band's singing about, and so. And I still listen to Dead Kennedys, and people are like lose their minds. And this is what upsets me the most is that, and I post things, you know, like
Mhm.
comments and stuff on other people's accounts. And I've had people just like lose their mind about, well, Jello Biafra's not punk anymore. He's this. I don't even know. Like I haven't
Well,
kept
I'll
up
tell
with
you
the
one
guy,
thing.
you know?
As one podcaster to another, I would
Uh-huh.
recommend not interviewing Jello Biafra.
Okay.
No, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
I'm honored that he came on my show and he gave a good episode,
Yeah.
but you'd better be prepared not to talk much. And you better be prepared to be the one to say, "Okay, we're done now."
Well, I'm guilty of that.
Or child's play.
Yeah. Okay.
Or 3 or 4 hours from when you hit record, you will still be listening to
Yeah.
Jello Biafra. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
he's oh God, we'd be nowhere without him in punk rock. But my God, what a fan of his own voice.
Isn't it interesting how, so since I haven't really kept track like that, like in my
Yeah.
brain, you know, I'm listening to, you know, Fresh Fruit album, or I'm listening to
Mhm.
Frankenchrist or something. And you know, I'm sitting there quoting all the words. I'm like, man, that's actually, that perspective is still pretty true. You know, like shooting blanks at TV when Kojak's on. I'm like, we got some people like that nowadays that, you know.
He's a remarkable mind. I was just trying to make you laugh and give you and tell you a relatable war story. Whoops.
Yeah. No, but I like that. But what what I want
Mhm.
is for people to understand, like, the political talk, you know, I didn't come from that. And so now, over the last few years, seeing how divisive people get, in my heart, I always want peace. I always want two people to get along, but I also want everybody to understand at some point we have to collaborate.
I didn't expect you and I to debate much, nor did I expect you to embrace a particular political perspective on this show. And for that reason, I feel like I predicted wisely. I picked the Carpenter's Cup, but what do you call it? I have an interesting hypothetical for you that plays into roughly what we're talking about right now, and I mean it. So I just told you the story of me and my friend Daryl.
Yeah.
And I also told you, I know musicians that have trended conservative. The great hypothetical that I wrestle with and that I would put to you is, let's say that our most extreme fears on either end of the political spectrum are actually in play right now. Let's say, and then I put this as a hypothetical. I do not ask you to make a declaration, yay or nay, on current reality.
Okay.
With the hypothetical that democracy is in play, or that the decisions in the highest level of government fold this republic or change our basic system of governance and sort of become something that's a betrayal of at least what were the suggested core elements of Americanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Relationships on the street level become extremely complicated, not because we don't talk to each other, not because we don't get along, but because, say, we're still talking, but it turns out that your closest friends turned out to be the wrong kind of Germans. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
because history doesn't look at the average German on the street in 1942 and say Nazi, non-Nazi.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had an eye-opening experience in 1994 when I was on tour, right? Which is one of the guys driving our tour buses. I think it was we stopped at I think it was his grandmother and grandfather's house, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was maybe his parents that we visited. But there's Grandpa on the mantle in his Nazi uniform.
Mm.
And there's a great crisis of conscience in Germany where the overwhelming Germans don't talk about the war, and they don't talk about Nazism, and they hold it in great distaste, and they are much, at least in the 1990s, had a much more adverse reaction to patriotism or nationalism or jingoism than we do.
Mm-hmm.
But they have this reality, which is that their own families and their own blood at some point were what the world perceives as the wrong kind of Germans.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a worst case scenario in America, and if our system goes to shit, what do we do with each other? And in that space, in facing that hypothesis, on the one hand, do you forgive ending up being something that helped grease the wheels for the wrong kind of Germany? Or do you acknowledge humanity and that, hey, that's my grandfather? It's going to be, hopefully it's not what we're dealing with, but it's a tricky ass fucking question.
Yes. I think, yeah.
Even Germany or any totalitarianism anywhere is so much more incredibly complex than we want it to be. At the end of the day, Nazis, genocide, bad, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The evolution, the path, and the intricacies that led to it, quite complicated.
Yeah, and I think that when I was in high school, I started reading about history. That was really like the only topic I enjoyed.
Right.
And part of that is understanding how World War II, became this war, this event. And then going back and studying through psychology, through experiments, and how human beings can be influenced to just do what they're told by an authoritarian figure, or that sort of thing.
Right.
And so you're right. I look at what the era we're in now and what 20 years from now or 30 years from now, what somebody studying history would say about this era. Just like you're saying, like, how could y'all have not seen that this was going on?
No, I post about that. The
history
occurs in real time. I did this thing recently, and I started using the analogy about a frog sitting in a pot. You bring it to a boil slow, and they never see it coming.
Yeah, in the age of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, it's the same thing. It's like, well, you can go back and look at the fallout from COVID. When that first started, I remember thinking, okay, this is going to be obviously historical, and how is it going to be addressed? And man, it was like early on, it seemed like everybody was kind of on the same sheet of music, like, hey, we just got to kind of keep distance. And then the next thing you know, well, not next thing you know, slowly, but it started becoming more political. And I can remember people talking about it, and I just,
my ex-wife is my ex-wife. I mean, we were divorced 14 years ago, but my ex-wife is an anti-vax, anti-mask person who ended up moving away from the coasts and probably the coastal elites. She's undergone a rather extreme cultural evolution. But I still know she's a person, and I still know what she's made of, and it's a tricky thing.
And
go ahead.
No, I like to interrupt you too, so we're good. Yeah. But it's one of those things that, like, that's one where I go, okay, we're talking about health. We're just talking about an infection, but how it quickly, became this polarizing issue. And I think that was I think everything was becoming polarized. Hell, look at coffee. I remember at one point, people were arguing if you drink Starbucks or if you drink Black Rifle coffee. And not everybody knows about Black Rifle coffee. But
I do.
Yeah. So it was like these two opposites, and people were aligning themselves with a brand, like, no, Starbucks stands for this, which basically was equating to the left. Black Rifle stands for the right,
Right.
And I'm like, look, I understand all this. I'm more of like, can I get a cheap cup of coffee and can I get in the middle? Like, where does, I don't know, Dunkin' Donuts stand on this? Like, I don't know. I make a joke.
You become Team Affleck.
Yeah. Like, man, I really just want to get a cup of coffee. And if I have to buy it from a store, I don't need people judging me on whatever cup it's in. But that was scary too, because at one point I worked Intel. So like on that, it was an intelligence unit, and it's like gang intel, criminal motorcycle intel. But also at that time, there was like, I don't want to say political violence, but there were movements that only wanted to destroy property and commit violence in the name of these, political ideologies or whatever. And like looking at that evolution and going, I hope this gets scaled back. Like, I don't want to see people, using, their right for freedom of speech and to protest, but also strapping rifles across their chests. Like,
Right.
we can't have that in the street. This is going to escalate to all out war. And sadly, I don't ever, and you and I are actually getting in a conversation that no one ever hears me talk about, but I like talking to you in the point that what we're talking about is real. And people, I think in America, back to the privilege kind of thing, the country as a whole has not, I mean, we have to go back generations for Civil War.
Yeah.
And to understand what moving forward, how bad this could be, in the sense of people walking around with rifles and then shooting at one another over basically a two-party system, Democrat or Republican. And then other people saying, hey there, Brian, like, you just think you're going to sit on the fence? No, buddy. Like, you better draw aside because it's go time.
Right.
And that's what makes me worry the most is I used to always tell my people, those who anger you control you. So if somebody is actively trying to make you angry for any reason, if it's somebody on the street pushing your buttons and they want you to punch them, while they're in handcuffs and they can get paid or whatever, like, understand that. Or if in life people are just doing this to you. And I guess I kind of go back to that anytime I'm talking to somebody and the conversations get heated. And it's kind of like they want me to be angry about something. Is this something I need to be angry about? Or are they trying to just do that in order to get me kind of emotionally involved in something that they feel is worth a physical altercation over or dying over? I do worry about that. And I do know there are people out there in organizations that are plotting and scheming and they will commit violence. And what I worry about is that in the street, it becomes almost like crews or like small cells of people that draw the line and they start to commit violence. And then, like anything, you can go back to Romeo and Juliet. It's like, which family are you going to be with,
Right. Well, and we've reached such a shock is not what it used to be. Like, desensitization is real. Right. And to such a degree that collectively we're not as appalled or shocked by anything anymore as we should be.
Right.
And so for that reason, we don't fear a horrible outcome or a horrible escalation on the level that we should, like on the level that you're talking about. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion we live in pretty dark days, but I will tell you right now that the failure of dialogue will only make them darker.
Yeah. I think it's a great way to put it. Is like, I hope at least if two people can talk or and not go straight to throwing fists or bullets, like there might be some hope.
Right.
But also I'm a realist and I know human behavior, and I don't like the path that we're on right now. Sure. I want people to understand that there's a whole lot more going on and we're just flooded with so much information. I don't know. I think critical thinking is a skill that we're starting to lose in America. And that is probably the number one factor I worry about the most. To question something is almost viewed by some people as you're already the enemy because you're questioning. Like, just
right.
Get in line. I can't get down with that. Like, I've never been that way. I wasn't that way with laws. I wasn't that way in any of my thinking. And also I'm so old now. Like, most people can make their own decisions in life. Just don't step on my toes. That's my thing. Like,
right.
Man, I've had people tell me what I should and shouldn't do, and I'm like, man, we're grown ass people. Like,
exactly.
You don't need to be in my business.
Right.
Hey, look, I'm gonna switch gears for a second. Like, these flyers back here.
So is this gonna be the part where you ask me what it was like to be on Revelation Records? We're an hour and a half in. I'm just fucking with you.
Yeah, no. So, yeah. Well, you were on Revelation, right?
I was on Revelation a few times. Yeah.
Yeah. And to most people listening, if they're into hardcore, they're like, okay, yeah, that's That's squared away,
That
right?
label is a lot of people's holy grail, and Jordan is a good friend. So it's a complicated thing because I'm not sure I adore their impact on the evolution of punk rock and hardcore, but I'm also a part of it,
Yeah.
Rebel, heal thyself,
Man, it's funny. There was this like image, at least when I
Mhm.
was a kid, of Revelation Records, and like
Mhm.
every band looking the same and sounding the same.
Mhm.
But in my ear, it wasn't that way. Like those hardcore bands to me did not all sound the same. And my introduction into it was it The Way It Is, the New York hardcore
Mhm.
compilation.
Yeah.
Like that opened the door. The minute that came out, and my brother bought it, and I was like, oh, that's it, dude.
Well, no for an answer is great distinction amongst the early Revelation bands, and our
Yeah.
great advantage, our superpower in the evolution of that label, is that we were shittier musicians, and we had a crappier layout because I did it. So, we had that going for us. I think we just had more of a. We're a little bit older than some of the guys, not than like Purcell or Ray, but like me and Gavin are older than the Side by Side guys or the Gorilla Biscuits guys. And we were, Christ, Gavin saw the Germs live, I mean, it was like, we came from a little bit dirtier rooms.
But your sound was more of like, to me, kind of fusing that punk or that just like stripped down rock sound with hardcore.
It was all we knew, and to us that was hardcore. What was funny was, when we started that band, we were fascinated with DC and with Government Issue, and all this melodic stuff. And I remember we were looking for a drummer. We were telling people melodic hardcore, think Government Issue, think somehow we said Stalag 13 as if Stalag 13 was Portrait of Melody. But then when we got in the room together, we sounded like what we grew up on and what all our friends' bands sounded like. We were playing it like DRI speed or like MDC speed because that was our DNA. We could sit here and look, fawningly towards all this artistic evolution on the East Coast or in Washington, D.C., really, but we didn't have the tools. At the end of the day, we're just fucking, bald-headed, run as fast as you could punk rockers. Hardcore. Also, that evolution was in full swing. It wasn't complete. You know what I mean? That breakdowns, hardcore, mosh parts as they call them, champion sweatshirts, all that wasn't quite codified. While you laugh was while we were grinding it out. It was coming into play, and probably arrived at around the crest of that. One of the reasons that whole evolution, high top Nikes, the look that has been like analyzed with a microscope in things like the We're Not in This Alone video, or I guess it's no, that's not what it is, but it's the Vegetarian video that Youth of Today did, where you got all the youth crewers standing on some auditorium stage in a park and everything else. By the time that hit and people were analyzing one another's fashion choices, I was like, shut it down. And for the last 40 for the last 40 years, I have worn nothing but plain black.
There you go.
Head to toe.
Yeah.
And when people started calling low top vans the O'Mahonys in Southern California, like when they would joke about it, I put them on the front of my next record and then titled the record, "This Isn't Me," with a picture of those shoes. So it's like that contrarian punk rock vein has always been a big part of it for me. That's why I've at times taken exception with Revelation and with the ongoing popularity of the Revelation bands, is that I felt like it on some levels it ran contrary to the nonconformist nature of this thing for me. But on the other hand, two things. If a Spotify shuffle puts Break Down the Walls on in my car, the next thing I know, 3 stoplights further down the road, I'm pointing my finger at the windshield and singing along with Ray. So to a certain extent, I'm full of shit. Now, granted, Youth of Today was living in my bedroom when that record was mastered.
Okay.
So it conjures up fond memories. But also, how the hell are you going to vilify championing sobriety amongst high school age kids? They were all of the Revelation bands for the most part were vocally anti-racist, pro tolerance and things. Now, from sort of a suburban white savior perspective, sure, but I'll take that over them being virulently racist.
Yeah.
You know, so it was like at the end of the day, it was a positive thing. I just felt like it could have been even better. You know, if Gorilla Biscuits didn't look like Side by Side, didn't look like Youth of Today,
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have been even more exciting, and the choices of the label to sign those individual bands would have been more impressive, because it wouldn't have been like you were providing a venue to the members of the club, but that you were actually seeking out the best work out there.
Yeah. I always wonder too, if I don't want to sound like a conformist at heart, but that idea of, I don't want to, get drunk or get into whatever, Coke, whatever. So I can align myself with this music, and like that idea of, okay, yeah. And wearing a Champion hoodie sweatshirt or something or whatever, and like Nike shoes. Cause that was the weird thing for me. When I started getting into punk, I was coming out of metal. So I always hung, my brother was older, and his friends, and they were into like Dio and Black Sabbath and Iron Maiden when we were really little. But I never could, I couldn't like get down with, the Number of the Beast. It really connects with me. I like the sound, but I didn't know anything about.
So I used to paint leather jackets for other people at my high school.
Yeah.
And a guy had me do a Venom jacket.
Okay.
With these two little angel, the two little devil babies were the logo. And for the rest of my life, always talk just still to Billy Rubin. I can talk about this guy, the stoner kid that had me do it, being like, "So, dude, are you done with my baby dudes yet?" Like that kind of conformity was a little bit more fun. I found those guys more entertaining. Like the goofiness of metal actually played more fondly for me than the regimentation and straight edge. I was thinking about something that I said to you just a few seconds ago, and I wanted to call out the hypocrisy in it, or at least the old age perspective, right? Which is, I just said all this shit about Champion sweatshirts and Nikes and everybody trying to look like the video that came out during the We're Not in This Alone period, right? So saith the guy who, I was 20 around that time, 20, 21 years old, right? So saith the guy who at 16 wore bleach splattered jeans, a black leather jacket, and combat boots, which made me like every single one of the other 2,000 kids at every Olympic auditorium show.
Yeah.
So it's not like I rolled out of the womb as the Grand Master of Nonconformity.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when you say that, because in, I think it was 6th grade, I had or 7th grade, I had a pleather jacket that I found in my mom's closet. So when we were kids, we were the latchkey kids, we were.
As was I. Yeah,
all right. I think a lot of kids punk grew
That's
up
that generation. You see all the memes now about playing outside until dark, and
Well, we were scavengers. Like that was a thing, like going through the dumpsters, getting stuff. So we would go through
video games are safer than sword fights with rebar,
shooting each other with bottle rockets and stuff.
Yeah.
So, but I found this old pleather jacket of my mom's. Now my brother and his buddy James had those like legit punk rock leather jackets, the cool ones,
I had those. Gavin Oglesby had those. Casey Jones had those.
So I couldn't get one because I was a broke little kid, so I had this they called it the Archie Bunker jacket, which I don't know why, but it was like a 70s cut butterfly collar. But in my brain, I'm like, it's leather, so it's got to be cool.
Right.
But my brother was into art, and he would make those stencils and stuff with paint markers.
Yeah.
So he stenciled, and it was badass. I wish I still had it. He stenciled circle jerks, in that logo or that font, and then did like the Skank Man logo, like silhouetted. I mean, I thought I was the coolest kid in town. Getting a 7th grade.
I mean, that's a Jackie Flannery Irish Mob jacket now. That's cool.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Fuck Archie Bunker.
Yeah. And it was but it was one of those, like when I wore that to school, teachers were looking at me like, what is that?
Yeah.
But I was trying to, like you said, I was trying to mimic what all these other punk rock kids were wearing.
So my whole thing was Youth of Today. They you look at pictures of them and they look like the John Jay High School wrestling team.
Yes.
Well, I used to have to run from the John Jay High School wrestling team, so fuck this noise. Not that there's not pictures of me in a giant white Notre Dame hoodie, if you look hard enough, or, there's, but it's just very, very early on, though. It came to lack something that I desperately needed from this music.
Yeah. I switched the same way. Like I got into that scene, that music, and really it was t-shirt and jeans for the most part.
Right.
But that idea of, I could, in my brain, like, man, I understand what they're saying. And for like when Judge came out, I tell a lot of people, like, the first time I heard a singer in straight edge and hardcore singing, but what I perceived at that age, at like whatever, 14, of someone who had actually lived it, had seen some addiction issues,
Well, here's the interesting thing about Mike and about Judge. To me, they were part of that militancy that I found really annoying. And the members of that band, with the exception of Mike, I don't view them as particularly hard men, right? But I'll tell you two things. Mike has lived a different life than his band members, right?
Yeah.
And I have boxed Mike Ferraro, actual boxing glove box Mike Ferraro, and Mike Ferraro can in fact break an egg. He's not. Judge rang a little bit more true. And interestingly, there's something about that big, scary fucking Odin down from the clouds voice of his, that is still oddly vulnerable. And I find it really relatable. As a guy who doesn't have much use for New York hardcore, I don't. I mean, hard to argue from an audio standpoint with the first Cro-Mags album. It just is that good, and a lot of other stuff is pretty good music too. But by and large, I find the extreme popularity of New York hardcore annoying. When the fuck did we decide to anoint a town? I come from the city that gave you the Circle Jerks, Black Flag, the Descendants, and 20 more bands we don't have time to name that are all better. Right?
Yeah.
But I will always go to bat for Mike Judge's voice and for the authenticity that comes across in his vocals. That said, he and I have gone round and round and debated, this is years ago now, but the need for new material from them. And I've told him I'll be first in line to buy the next record, by the next 12 Mike Judge singing hardcore songs. But I don't know if I'm going to fork out my hard cash to go see Bringing It Down or whatever it's called. In a different century. As an adult, and my background, I'll still listen to Judge, still love it. And you're right, that was to me the same thing. That was that tipping point where it started getting really, really militant. Some of the bands after that, I was like, okay. But as an adult, going back and like riding into work and listening to Judge, and I'll go, man, like I hear it in a way that I've experienced people crying and screaming at either overdose scenes or banging their head in a wall saying, I don't want to live this way anymore. What am I supposed to do? So I could hear it in his voice, but coming through in an angry way. I just, I don't know. Yeah. I just thought about something. This is old age. I may have boxed Mike Judge. When they were staying at my house, we had boxing gloves and everybody beat hell out of each other in my garage. It may have been me or may have been Regis from Chorus of Disapproval that boxed Mike. But either way, the dude could hit. I wish I could accurately remember which post-adolescent boys punched each other in the face. Dude, I wish I could remember which youth crew legends actually duked it out. I know that Pat Line, I've used this on other podcasts, but I know that Pat Longery from Uniform Choice, who was the smallest of all of us, beat the holy hell out of me. God, what an athlete. I hope he goes and plays on the freeway.
When I was flipping through 7-inch records earlier, I flipped across a Chorus of Disapproval. Like immediately,
so those guys are younger than a couple years younger than me, but like Regis, the bass player, lived two city blocks over. I lived on Magnolia. He lived on Brookhurst. The world all seemed so much smaller back then.
Yeah. Well, look, man. Obviously we could keep talking, and I've actually
we're at the 2 hour mark, man. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say I have purposely not gone into different topics or just let my brain wander and ask questions because I know we'll sit here and talk forever. I do want to be able to get you another slot, man, to come back and talk about some other stuff. And
it was a really fun conversation. I'd love to.
Yeah. I appreciate your time, buddy. What is, because people are going to ask me, what's the easiest way for people to get in touch with you who don't already know about you? Because
messaging on the social networks.
Okay.
I mean, I don't share my emails for the most part, and I'm 57 years old. I have a full-time job. I'm pondering whether or not it would be ludicrous for me to start another band, but if people want to reach out about the podcast or anything else, you just message me. You can just direct message me. I'm not the box is not exactly exploding.
Well, maybe it will be now. Like you might get some people ask some very interesting questions. So
fair enough.
Good.
All right.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Hey, I appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Brian.
Yes, sir.